I want to join Mary Evelyn and Richie in thanking everyone who's organized this panel, the Festival of Faith. I want to also particularly name Owsley Brown, who tried to get me to come to the Festival of Faith for years and years. I'm actually not here in person, but I am at Lamont Doherty, which is the environmental research campus of Columbia University, which happens to be next door to my house. So I'm happy I was able finally to join at least this way. I want to start by naming some legacy dilemmas that we need to face. One is the fact, the often ignored fact that the land that we populate in America was actually stolen from Native Americans, from Indians, and the other big dark secret of American history, of course, is slavery, which the economy was built on. And I recently saw a review of a book that tracks the way in which slave patrols, that is, armed groups that look for runaway slaves, became police forces in this country. So you wonder, why do we have such widespread racial bias? Why is white supremacy found in so many different minds in so many different places? And I think it's because it's part of the legacy of not the American dream, maybe the American nightmare, but it's still a reality. And the question is, if it's part of the normal narrative of so many people today, what could we do to reverse it? And something that Mary Evelyn said makes me think of an analog I'd like to go into. One book, Rashad, you didn't mention that I wrote is called Ecological Intelligence, and it's my look at ecology and the environmental crisis. And one of the things I found was that everything we use and buy, every material good, no matter how virtuous we want to be, has a negative footprint environmentally. And this footprint is in many, sometimes all of the 8 major systems that support life on the planet that range from, the CO2, which we hear a lot about, to biodiversity, drinkable water, you name it. And Mary Evelyn really alluded to all of them. So the American dream, as she said, has devolved into stuff, accumulating stuff. And all of that stuff harms the environment. Interestingly, Mary Evelyn mentioned companies that are doing something about it. Actually, companies could do much, much more because there is a methodology. It's called life cycle assessment. There's a discipline, industrial ecology, that deploys this. Most people in that discipline are hired by companies to assess the impacts of their products, and the findings are kept proprietary. But what if they were open source? What if we all knew them? What if we knew the actual impacts of something we were about to buy at the point we were about to purchase it? This could change the way we made decisions, particularly in the younger generation. I'm thinking of my granddaughter, the Gen Z, as Mary Evelyn said, Gen Z is really full of eco-anxiety. So if we were able to make the actual impacts transparent, I think that younger people particularly would make buying decisions accordingly. So I bring that up as an analog because I think the blind spots that we all share about the actual impacts of the things we buy and use are quite analogous to the blind spots that we find everywhere when it comes to racial bias, to bias of all kinds. And I think that the solutions have to do with surfacing what those biases are, making them transparent, and then modeling the idea, telling a new story that it's not really that great. So let me get back to systemic racism. In recent years, hate speech has spread like a virus, and it's spread through social media, it's spread through modeling. the question is, and this is just taking a note from Mary Evelyn, could we do the same with love speech? Could we have an antithetical point of view, a different story, a different narrative that really talked about the kindness that Richie mentioned and really tried to further that kindness? I think that one of the ways to do this has to do with educational programs, which both Mary Evelyn and Richie have alluded to. Rashad, you mentioned that I have been an advocate of teaching social and emotional competencies to kids in schools. Actually, those programs have pretty much gone viral. They're found in many, many schools around the world, not just in this country. I think that what they lack and what maybe we can add is the importance of kindness and a sense of belonging. Richie, when you and I were graduate students at Harvard, there was a social psychologist named Tom Pettigrew. He had done a study of what was then the war in Serbia and Croatia, where he found that people from those countries who did not harbor bias against the enemy, the so-called enemy, had one thing in common, and that was that they had childhood friends from the other group. And can we use that? Can we mobilize that? Can we use the fact that, for example, Vanessa Dreskat at the University of New Hampshire finds that the top performing teams in companies and organizations all have a very strong sense of belonging. That is, the people who are part of those teams feel at home there. And can we extend that belonging to kids in the school, to our neighbors? I'm not optimistic about our ability to change the narrative of people who already have a bias cemented. I think the hope is in future generations. It's in our kids. And it will take longer, but I think it might be more pervasive to change the story with them, to change the experience with them, to go from, to get them to have that procedural understanding of how not to be biased, but to create a sense of kindness and belonging. And let me just close with something the Dalai Lama often says. He says, there are 7 to 8 billion people on this planet, and we're all the same, but we need to learn to live together well. I think that's the lesson, that's the story we want to tell. Thank you.
Richie, Mary Ellen, would you like to chime in and share some thoughts?
Well, I just want to pick up, Dan, thanks for your comments and the fact that your comment about businesses got a strong response. I think that's absolutely right. And we can go on about B Corps that are rated this way and so on. And I do think, and also investment, finance, the fossil fuel divestment program is now at $40 trillion, a third of which is from religious communities. So, finance is changing under pressure, for sure. My brother's head of Chubb Insurance in New York, and he is terribly concerned about climate change, as all the insurance companies are. They need to be brought to the table, you see.
Yep.
But I do think our businesses with leaders within and the next generation, our students aren't going to work for people who are destroying the planet or law firms that are doing the same thing. So I fully agree with that. But we should be even more conscious of what is happening within business, of entrepreneurship, social Patagonia. We can name so many of these groups that are giving us hope for change. So I thank you for that point. And of course, open source and disclosure is really an important part of it. So it can't just be greenwashing. We're doing all this goodness. It's got to be pushed to transparency.
And Mary Evelyn, let me just underscore, I think that we have very auspicious beginnings here and there. If you look at the totality of the world of business and commerce, it's actually a small minority, I'm sad to say. And I'd love to see this transparency about eco-impacts become a universal. And I think it may be driven by younger generations. Gen Z, as you say, is full of eco-anxiety, one way to allay that anxiety is to say, you know, this widget is better than that widget for the planet, and you can buy this widget, the better one, because that's going to create a market force that will make people chase that market share without having to change the reality of the priorities and values of people in business. The fact is that if you want to have talent among young people, as you just pointed out, if you want to have market share, you've got to do the right thing for the planet.
Absolutely. I just want to give a shout out to this book on donut economics. And she is doing such great work in Europe, based in Oxford, Karen Rothorn, I forget her last name, but cities in Europe are doing this, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and et cetera, new indices of what is appropriate progress or economic health and well-being for these cities, and not overshoot, and what do we do with our waste and so on. So accountability and responsibility within new economic systems.
Yeah, there are actually, just on that note, there are a group of nations, developed nations now, that are part of a group, I believe it's 7 or 8, and growing, that call themselves well-being economies.
Yes.
And interestingly, 4 out of the original 7 are led by women, including New Zealand, Iceland, Finland. Those are 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to get back to one point that Dan made, which I think is really important about Dan's increased optimism about changing the narrative in the next generation, which I very much agree with. And just wanted to point out 2 things. One is that we know that there's increased plasticity in the brain at this age. It's undergoing more change, and these are sensitive periods in development that's the term we use. Sensitive periods in development where the narrative can be more easily changed based upon the state of the brain. And so this is a real opportunity and invitation. And the other point is that it doesn't actually take that much. There's a study that was published just a couple of years ago with kids in the United States, teenagers, who were African-American teenagers from low-income families in the Northeast, where they were asked to write about values that went beyond themselves. For example, their family, their community. And they did this simple writing exercise for 4 times over the course of 1 year, for 10 minutes each time. So it's a total of 40 minutes over the course of 1 year. Those kids were significantly more likely 7 years later to graduate from a 4-year college. So it doesn't actually take much to activate a very different narrative. And we need to deploy those strategies in our educational systems, and it's really quite urgent.
You know, Mary Evelyn, when you talk about B Corps, and it really triggered for me thinking about this proliferation of ESGs, ESG index funds, and frankly, it's like, you're just copy and pasting the S&P 500, and everybody's in ESG, right? And so there really is sort of this watering out effect of what it actually means to do business with a sense of what is good for the environment, what is good for communities, what is good socially. Mm-hmm. And that really does require some attention and some intentionality. Yes. And I'm really interested in how we get to some of the granularity and, just generally speaking around some of those questions. But Daniel, you lifted up this idea of what if we could see the impact of our consumption. And it makes me think of sort of when you go to a McDonald's or Burger King, you can see the calories on the menu, right? And so is there an analog there? Is it apples to apples or perhaps Big Macs to Big Macs as we think about those comparisons? But what kind of difference or what kind of relationships exist there? So, all of that is really, I think, interesting as we think about how those different processes can have different outcomes.
Mary Evelyn, could I speak to the hamburger question?
Yeah. Sure.
You
I'm a
know, it's nice to
vegetarian,
know
but
the
you can speak
calories.
to it.
It's good to know the calories in a Big Mac, but how many acres of the Amazon were cleared in order to raise the cattle that supplied the beef for your hamburger? That's the kind of thing I'm looking at. It means going back deep into the supply chain to look at what was extracted or what was done to the planet in order for us to have this hamburger, whatever it may be.
Yeah. No, there's no question. I think, and see, this is where I think we have to think more holistically, more integratively. The Europeans have been using this word, the polycrisis. You know, our School of the Environment, 125 years old, created many leaders. They're deeply interested in food issues. They're deeply interested in health, like you're working on at Louisville and so on. But they're finally, and I think this is a post-George Floyd moment, that the School of the Environment is finally getting human issues and diversity. Because by and large, the environmental movement has been about land, not always people, except for certain organizations. But what I'm trying to say is both the movement, TNC, Nature Conservancy, and all these groups, Trust for Public Land, of course, they're saying this has to be together. Our divinity schools have been a little bit more about social justice than the environment. The students are pressing. These are not separate issues. So that's part of the energy and the spirit. And I really want to give a shout out to this next generation, because they do have eco-anxiety, but they're not giving up hope. And I like to say, let's give them an intergenerational handshake, you know, to do this work. And it seems to inspire. We're not abandoning them, we're encouraging them in their creativity, I think.
And I'll just say too, I appreciate that part of what we're contextualizing too is the way some of these harmful narratives have generated, in particular, racialized white supremacist outcomes. And it's worth us noting that these processes of narrative are not new.
Yeah.
We know that the Daughters of the Confederacy were instrumental in making sure that libraries and schools had the lost cause and materials of that nature. So there are these ways in which narrative has been weaponized for the purposes of maintaining where we are. Daniel, you talked about the slave patrols being the evolution of modern day policing. So when we talk about the murders of Breonna Taylor here in Louisville by LMPD and the murders of George Floyd, in what ways have we allowed these unchecked white supremacist processes shape narrative and therefore allow and guarantee in some respects these kinds of outcomes?
I just have to jump in, sorry. I mean, my husband, as I said, is a historian and student of Native traditions. If we knew as much as he knew about the travesty of the treatment of indigenous peoples that still goes on, we've been adopted into a family on the Crow tribe. We've been on many reservations. These are third world countries. It's incredible. But as well, the history of slavery. It's incredible that we have, here's the issue. We haven't told our history. And we're just finally telling it, and now it's controversial to tell our history? Please. So it's a beginning. It's going to be contested, surprisingly. But that contestation is going to push us forward to tell it better and better. And I may be critical of academia and its elitisms and so on at places like Yale, but people are pressing so hard on colonialism, on inclusivity, and telling the histories right. And they are publishing out the yin-yang to tell this correctly and insist that they support. Our teachers, K through 12, need support in this, right? That's where we can put our energy back into the educational system. Tell our history, tell our story.
Yes.